Hello and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and today I'm going to talk about stories told with statistics. What they also tell us about the person doing the storytelling, and what the numbers actually say about teen social media use and mental health. I remember someone once telling me that analysis is numbers plus a narrative. In other words, that analysis is telling a story with facts. At the time, I wasn't sure about it. Were facts and stories compatible? Surely the narrative got in the way of objectivity. How could that work? Over time, I've learned that this is exactly what analysis is, and that facts without a story are almost useless. We need something to tie the facts together, and we need to know the contents of the facts. As I discussed with Kelly back in episode 6 about narrative non-fiction, even when we tell a factual story, we are crafting a narrative. While I do think it's possible to be fairly objective, to do this we need to be aware of our own biases and to own them. Even then, we pick which facts to include and which to leave out and what we say about them. As I'm sure all listeners know, we also need to beware that many people deliberately pick and distort their facts to suit their story. Today I'm going to look at some of the ways they do this and some of the subtler things that can muddy the waters when it comes to telling a story with facts. The head of the Australian Bureau of Statistics was in the news a few months ago, as they had issued a statement clarifying the different types of migration data they have and what that data can tell us. Some far-right protest groups called this censorship. This bit is ridiculous. The far-right group weren't stopped from saying anything. They were just hauled on their bullshit. Pointing out someone is lying or misrepresenting something is not censorship. These claims about censorship are another narrative that I'll cover at some point, but this episode I'm focusing on statistics and stories. And this recent Australian migration story is a great example of starting off by making sure the story you are being told uses the right statistics. So, to do that, we need to start with a bit of context. People coming and going from a country can be measured in several different ways. There's total migration, that's the number of people arriving in and then staying in that country. Then there's net migration, which is where you subtract the people emigrating from the people immigrating. Wow, those aren't confusing words at all. Net migration is where you get the total of number of people moving to a country and subtract the number of people moving away from that country. So the total change. A third way to measure it is overseas arrivals and departures, which is the total numbers of people coming and going, whether it's for holidays, business, or longer term. Each of these is useful in their own way. But to understand something like the impact migration is having on overall population numbers, you need net migration. Total immigration won't tell you about the people leaving, and departures and arrivals will be higher due to visitors. And so this is why the ABS issued a statement. The far right was stirring people up, claiming the population of migrants was skyrocketing because of the overseas arrival numbers, and ignoring that most of those people would be leaving after a few weeks of business or holiday. Sure, if all those people were staying, it might put a bit of pressure on services, but that's really not happening. This is a clear example of blatantly misusing stats for stories. But what about when the numbers are less clear? Sometimes that can make the story harder to pass and make it easier to get away with distorting the numbers. So, once again, a story. A story of me scrolling through Blue Sky and getting angry. It's definitely not a unique circumstance, but this at least got me thinking and examining the data rather than rage posting. As I was scrolling, I came across a headline saying, to quote, "Today's teenage mental health crisis and social media panic are founded in nostalgic myths." Okay, cool, was my first reaction. I had been wondering if the alleged crisis was a bit overblown, but at the same time, there does seem to be a lot of distress out there, so what's the evidence here? I took a closer look at the graph which was being used to support the story. Oh boy, it's, well, to begin with, it's more complicated than the headline implies. As I said, from there, I got angry. But in hindsight, having calmed down and read the entire article rather than just the headline, the argument isn't actually bad, just simplified, which is, after all, the purpose of a headline. More on what the graph does and doesn't show in a minute. What I found just as interesting was some of the responses to the article, the comments and quote posts it got. Some responses were agreeing, others were looking at the same data and telling a completely different story. Being a lover of stories, that caught my attention. It very much seemed that there were two groups of people looking at the same data and seeing different things. So I wanted to explore how different people interpreted the same graph, and also how the way it was put together could affect these interpretations. To start off, I need to describe the graph. This is going to be one of the trickier episodes to do in an audio format. I'll do my best to describe it, and I'll also include it with the sources on my website. The graph shows the data on United States 12th graders' happiness from 1975 to 2025. It comes from the Monitoring the Future survey, which, when I looked into it, seems to be mostly about drug use with a few other questions thrown in. But the graph shows responses to the question, taking all things together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say you're very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy these days? The graph shows the percentage of 12th graders each year that answered either very happy or not too happy. It doesn't show the pretty happy group, other than to mention that it was 65% throughout. And here is my first quibble. Ideally, you'd show all three responses, and possibly the don't want to say or non-response group as well. The text on the graph does state that the pretty happy group is consistent at 65%, while the variation is in the other two groups, but that's not ideal. There are also no grid lines or y-axis, the axis on the side of the graph. Some of the lower and higher points on the lines are marked with a value, which helps, but it's still quite hard to follow. The two lines that are shown are also fairly consistent for most of the graph, with around 14 to 17% not too happy and around 17% very happy, up until about 1995. Given the author says that 65% are pretty happy throughout, I'm not sure where the slightly higher variation in the not too happy group comes from. Either there was some oscillation around the 65% score, or there were varying numbers of respondents who didn't answer. I don't know. as it's not shown on the graph or mentioned in the write-up. After 1995, there is a shift. Very happy goes up to about 25% and not too happy down to around 12%. This carries on until around 2010, after which happiness slowly decreases and not too happy increases. Unsurprisingly, unhappiness then spikes during COVID. Since then, it has bounced back a bit, but is currently closer to the 1980s levels than the 2000s. The most recent year is sitting at 15% very happy and 18% not too happy. And again, the mystery 65% in between. If you're somewhere where you can do so, please do take a look at the graph, or try and picture it from the description. What does it tell you about the happiness of United States 12th graders over time? What does it tell you about their current state of happiness? I did try to look more closely at the data that the graph was based on, but that was easier said than done. I think the blog author must have downloaded the data and made the graph from scratch. I would have needed to request access to the data to repeat it, and I'm not sure being a random podcaster qualifies me for access, so I didn't go down that road. I did contact the author, Mike Males, and ask, but while he did reply to the message, he didn't answer my question about whether he'd made the graph or why he'd left off grid lines and the mostly happy group. So, to go back to the reason it caught my interest, on Blue Sky, different people were using the same graph to tell different stories. One story was that current 12th graders are fine. They have around the same level of happiness as those between 1975 and 1995, so nothing to worry about. A different story was, wait, current 12th graders are less happy than those between 1995 and somewhere between 2010 and 2015, so surely we should be aspiring to at least that level. Now, both of these stories are based on the facts in the graph, but they're quite different. One focuses on the more recent history and sees a drop. The other looks further back and sees consistency. Neither are wrong, per se. It's about where you put the emphasis. There was also the point that it may still be too soon after COVID to really tell what the long-term trend is, which is also fair, but there is still a bit of a decrease in happiness in the pre-2020 data. If you remember back to the headline, today's teenage mental health crisis and social media panic are founded in nostalgic myths. You'll see it was telling the first story. And that's where I started to get annoyed. Teens today are less happy than 20 years ago. That's what the numbers show. How is that a nostalgic myth? But then I took a deep breath and followed my own advice. I read the whole article rather than just the headline. And surprise, surprise, nuance appeared. The article is particularly aimed at boomers and Gen Xers, who are the main ones controlling policy in the US and who are the ones freaking out about social media and its effects. Even if us elder millennials are now in our 40s, shush, we're still generally not the ones driving that narrative. The author actually made the point that millennials, the first generation to grow up with the internet, were also the happier anomaly. So maybe it's something other than the internet that is dragging kids down? Maybe the internet's even what was lifting them, or rather, us, up. To be fair, the spike of unhappiness during COVID would suggest that what most of us already know, it does take more than the internet. But something was going right in the 2000s. There are also people that took different messages again from the graph. Some were reasonable, such as pointing out that we may still be too close to COVID to know where the graph will level out at, and that basing any argument on the data is questionable, which is a fair point. However, one poster seemed, to my reading, to be saying that because it was too soon to tell, that in itself was evidence that there was a mental health crisis among young people, which would be just as wrong in the other direction. Yeah, the COVID spike in the graph is bad. And everyone, but especially young people, had a tough time during COVID. But if you're arguing that it's too soon to tell if the spike in unhappiness is dropping off, surely that means it is also too soon to tell if it is being maintained. Others made a similar point to the one I did. Why are we comparing the most recent 12th graders to those from 40 or 50 years ago rather than 20 years ago? This one I think is tougher to answer. I've touched on one of the reasons. The blog is using the similarities between Gen Alpha and the boomers and Gen Xers that are critical of them to try and make a point to those critics. It is also using it to make the case that if 12th graders were relatively happy up to 2015, well after the first iPhone in 2007 and when most people were on social media, then the cause is likely something else. Or at the very least, more complicated. I'm on board with both of those points. However, I do think the author missed the wood for the trees a bit in that analysis. Yes, the goal was to stop boomers and Gen Xers criticising young people. Well, first off, good luck. They've been doing it all of my life, and I think they will only stop as they slowly die off. But I can see the point. They were no better off when they were young, so yeah, boomers back off. However, a distinct drop in happiness from around 2013, 2015 to the present is, I think, something to be concerned about. It was present both before the pandemic and in the most recent numbers. That pre-pandemic drop definitely gets lost in the headline. And also, I don't think it gets the emphasis it deserves in the article itself. I do agree that it's probably not the fault of phones and social media. Or at least, there's more going on than that, but I do think there is an issue there. I'll come back to that more in a bit. But first, more on interpretation. I posted the graph without any additional context on a couple of Discord servers I'm a member of and asked for people's thoughts. The responses are definitely not a wide sample of people, and there were so few I would hesitate to even say they were representative of the servers. However, they were thoughtful and interesting and helped shape my thinking overall. So, many thanks to all of those who chipped in. Several people found the graph hard to follow, given the absence of a y-axis and the imprecise labelling. However, they all picked up the same pattern, that there was an increase in reported happiness from 1995, which decreased again from 2010 to 2015. I was rather wondering if they would fall into one of the analysis groups I discussed already, but that wasn't really what came up. Several people presented hypotheses for the trends. Unfortunately, I have no way of testing them, but they are interesting, especially in the context of the wider narratives around why teens are unhappy. One person suggested that the arrival of social media and the internet from 1995 on let people detach from their parents a bit. They saw it as a positive, a way to get more diverse perspectives on the world, and that this could be part of why millennials were happier. This was particularly interesting as it was shared independent of the article, which came to a similar conclusion. Another also suggested better connections with others via social media might be a factor. There were also a few hypotheses about the 2013-ish drop. Several people mentioned Gamergate, so the downside of the internet, and the escalation of the culture war followed by Trump's election. Again, I think these are reasonable hypotheses, but without access to the data and the fact that it's just snapshot in time data, we can't really test them. Overall, people talked about both things that would affect teenagers directly, like changes in school funding, but also the wider economic and political picture at the time. Interestingly, no one put forward the hypothesis that Mike Mail suggested in his newsletter. His idea is that this is more about what is going on with the parents of the 12th graders. This is a lot trickier to measure with surveys, but he points out that parent-aged people, which is quite broad, had increasing levels of substance misuse and overdose at the same time as teens' unhappiness was increasing. I looked into the numbers myself. The decrease in teen happiness definitely correlates with the US opioid crisis, which was declared a public health emergency in 2017. It's a plausible explanation and also doesn't contradict the ideas that it may be related to other things like the wider economic situation, and it's probably a combination, as most things are. But when it comes down to it, the survey can only tell us what 12th graders said about their happiness in response to that one question. And because of this, it can be used to tell a few different stories when it's shared in isolation. Looking at other data, such as opioid overdoses, can give us clues, but correlation is not causation. The more umbrella sales there are, the more car accidents there are. But there's no point in banning umbrellas when the cause is actually the rain. So to loop back to where I'm going with this episode, with the limited information, the numbers can be misrepresented as saying more than they actually do. The story doesn't end here. I've read a few more newsletters by Mike Mails, and he has shared other data that backs up his theory. In other research, 2/3 of teenage depression is linked by the CDC to abuse in the home. I mean, that's fucking heartbreaking aside from anything else. It is also notably not social media, which seems to be getting blamed for everything these days. And, yeah, it's a narrative I bought into for a while. I had some bad social media experiences, and it made it easy to buy into the horror stories of social media bullying that's been linked to suicides. And yes, one death is one too many. I bought into the arguments for a social media ban to try and reduce the risk, but actually, for the most part, the data doesn't support it. I was wrong, and once I looked at the evidence properly, I realised that. There are studies helpfully collated by Mike Mails on another one of his blog posts to show that teens who spend more time on social media are actually less likely to harm themselves and are generally mentally healthier. The trend isn't linear. In fact, there is a slight increase, and we really are talking slight. Slight increase in mental ill health for those who are using social media hourly rather than several times a day. So there does seem, as with most things, to be a happy medium. Those in the middle, social media usage-wise, were on average happier than those who either used it hourly or not at all. But that's not something that's going to be achieved by a total ban. Also, teens with the worst home lives spent the most time on social media. Possibly it's an escape rather than part of the problem. I do wonder if they are in that very high usage and slightly worse mental health group as well. That's absolute conjecture on my part, based on the patterns, but not something I can tell from the data. So, if teens are not more unhappy than boomers and Gen X, why is there a panic about their mental health and about social media? why is there a narrative about how harmful it is for kids? If the data doesn't support it, where is all of this coming from? The cynic in me thinks that it's because banning social media for teens is cheaper than funding mental health services and easier than addressing the complex parental issues and abuse in the home that seems to be at the root of at least some of these problems. Which reminded me of something else. There's a theory that one of the roots of the satanic panic was that people were becoming more willing to talk about childhood sexual abuse. But the public struggled to come to terms with the idea that it was mostly perpetrated by trusted people in the home. It was easier to believe that it was a satanic conspiracy doing this heinous thing. That's another story I should dig into someday. I've listened to and read so many things about the satanic panic that I can't remember exactly where I came across this. I think it was one of Sarah Marshall's excellent podcasts. But it does make me wonder if this anti-phone, anti-social media panic is a variation on the theme. The problem can't be abuse in the home. It must be this external thing. In other words, another story that we tell ourselves to shift the blame away from the uncomfortable things. Something else that might be a factor, and again we're well in conjecture territory here, is that teens are more vocal about their mental health or lack of it. It's becoming more acceptable to talk about. We have better language around it, and they have more ways to both find out about it and to say it. They can Google it and then post about it on Instagram. They can follow people talking about having experiences similar to theirs on TikTok, and then even, gasp, bring these conversations into the real world, at home, at school, and with friends. They're no less happy than the teens of the 80s, but they may be more willing to talk about it. I wouldn't be surprised if at least some of the commentators actually wanted kids to shut up about their problems, rather than doing anything about them. Which would fit with advocating phone and media bans. You can't ask for help if you can't talk to anyone. After I'd written that point in an earlier version of this script, Mike Males shared a similar-ish theory in his newsletter. Generation C and Alpha are using social media to be a lot more politically engaged than previous generations. Not only are they using social media to talk about mental health, they are using it to learn about things like Gaza, Ukraine, and climate change. Another potential reason for some in power to want to cut off sources of information and get the kids to shut up. And this takes me off down the final tangent of the episode. While scrolling Instagram, I came across a clip from a film called Freedom Writers. It's based on a true story of a teacher and her students in Long Beach, California, and the diaries the students write. It's a really interesting story, but there was something else that caught my attention. Surprise. The students and their teacher published a collection of the diary entries. This book has since been banned in some schools for being pornographic. Teens, the same age as the students were when they wrote those diary entries, have been barred from reading them. Now, I haven't read the book myself, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this may have more to do with the book including the experiences of people of colour from a poor area than any particular scenes depicted. Many movements to protect the children are actually to shield them from learning about people different from themselves and challenging the status quo. Much like teens who learn about Gaza on social media. Now, I do think there should be some guardrails. A 10-year-old shouldn't be reading the same things as a 16-year-old. And there are some things that people should learn about in supportive environments where they can ask questions and discuss their feelings about the content. However, blanket bans on social media or on mentions of sex in books are not helpful. It needs nuance. Sometimes this will be age limits or restrictions where a text is only read as part of a class so students get the context and support from the teacher. And it is hard to put that sort of nuance into policy making, but it is possible. And to bring it back to where I started, understanding and interpreting statistics also needs that nuance and that context. The answers I come up with will depend on the questions I ask and can be easily distorted if I don't acknowledge the context. Reading a diary entry about sex out of context might actually, seem a bit pornographic to someone who doesn't like discussions of sex. But in the context of it being diaries of young people who are trying to understand and manage their lives, then suddenly it becomes something that people can learn from. And it can be easily distorted if I don't acknowledge that context. Like the migration data I mentioned at the top of the episode, the number of arrivals isn't the same as the number of migrants, and without that context, the numbers can be misleading. Sometimes we all need someone like the head of the ABS to step in and provide context. Parents and other caregivers and teachers should definitely be engaging with their kids and the kids in their care on what they see on social media. And ideally, we'd build a society where everyone has the time and energy and headspace to do so. But I don't think bans are the answer. So, speaking of context, as always, my sources are on my website, which is ourstoriesandourselves.com. If you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. And as always, feed the algorithm with likes, reviews, and subscriptions, or just tell your friends. Until next time, write your own story.